Well, thank you. Thanks to Kirby Wynn and Garfield County for sponsoring this event and an opportunity to talk about the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission's Flowline Rules. Pretty much what I'd like to walk through today is kind of a little bit of background on our flowline regulations and at least a little perspective on the 2017 NTO. The rules we just created in February of last year. We did a work group on instrument monitoring of flow lines, and then of course I've got to throw in one slide on our new legislation that was just passed. So providing a little bit of background on sort of how we go at regulating flow lines. It really started in 2014 when the legislature asked us to do a risk analysis. And they were really going after risk related to hydraulic fracturing and drilling. But really what came out of that study, it was really production facilities, sort of the long term after you've drilled the well, after you have completed the well, and you're in production. That's really where more of the risk was. And the risk we used to evaluate that was we had a third party firm audit our spill reports, inventory staff, and some outside sources they interviewed. And the walk away really was that, well, if you can see the chart, you can see that the production facilities and the process piping, that's the piping right on location, the tanks, the valves, that's where all the liquid leaks were. So it's kind of interesting walk away when you kind of look at that. And I've got some charts where we audited that data that I'll show a little bit later on. But that was one perspective that was kind of interesting in 2014. And part of that is we created, in the engineering group, we created an integrity group. And that was their main focus, is the integrity of these process pipes and the flow lines. And of course, we had an event in 2017 that we created an NTO. And the biggest walk away from that, and what we asked operators to do, is when you have these risers, this pipe sticking out of the ground. The riser is that surface connection of a buried pipe that comes out of the ground. You can connect things to it, and you can float liquids through that line. We engaged with operators that they had to remove any of those unused risers that were within 1,000 feet of a building unit. We also required that all lines be pressure tested, and that was our rule at that time. Pre-2018. So the idea is to get those things removed. And also, if it needs to stay, we want some kind of tag on that, instructing sort of the use of that. So basically the term is lockout, tag out, so that somebody's just not inadvertently going to open and close that valve. And then, of course, in 2018, we created a set of rules. We took what was a 3-page rule and turned it into approximately an 18-page set of rules. So it's a pretty dramatic change. And it had various elements to it. As far as registration of this line, we want to know where they are. And what we've done is we created a Form 44. We are a very form-driven agency. We collect a lot of data. And again, I'll kind of show some of that data here in a second. But then we also created some definitions. We now have, you've got your process piping, flow line, on location. And then you have all of these lines that are going off location. And that's where your risk might get a little bit greater, because when you're on location, the operator is in control of that location. When you get off location, say you have your set of wells, and then you have a tank battery that's off location, and you're now pumping those fluids to a location. The operator's a little bit doesn't have as much control of that surface use. So that's the ones we really want registered with our Form 44. Also, we defined a few things. We have what we're calling our flow lines, but we also have larger crude oil transfer lines. We have produced water lines, and those might be more of in a system. And we meet with our sister agency, the Colorado Public Utilities Commission, and they regulate gas lines under a relationship with PHMSA, the federal government, Pipeline Safety Group. Pipeline Safety Group regulates the larger interstate gas lines. They also regulate all what are called hazardous liquid lines. But of course, they have caveats to that, and you have to dive into their rules, which are kind of complicated in some regards. But they have size restrictions and they have classifications. But what we're trying to regulate with these transfer lines are those lines that are under those two other agencies' regulations. And then we have an integrity management section, 1104, that describes the various types of management, and then of course abandonment. One of the big things taking an opportunity to remind operators that the rules became effective a year ago, May 2018, but October of this year, end of October, you need to have all of your flow lines registered. So all of those off-location lines that aren't on location, you need to have completed a Form 44, and our staff can help you with that. But that's a key point to remember. Our integrity management program has multiple different regulations within it, and the key point is what the regulations before 2018 had is that you needed to pressure test your line. But many of the operators are doing continuous pressure monitoring. They have a SCADA system, a centralized monitoring system, monitored 24/7. They have pressure monitors on a lot of those lines, so they can SCADA that into a centralized facility, so there's continuous monitoring. The way the previous rules were written, that was not really an allowed method. So what we did is after the 2014, we created a policy that they could, if they were doing continuous monitoring, they could ask for a variance to allow that. But as you can walk through this, there's various elements within that. And of course, one of the disconnects that we had when we made these rules in 2018 was this, J, well, good enough, J, so 1104J2, we were trying to focus on the use of instruments as an element of an AVO, audio, visual, olfactory. So you physically walk that line. Can I hear something? Can I smell something? Can I see something? An audio, visual. But also the use of instruments. Can I use any of those instruments to monitor that? That would be like an optical imaging camera, the laser camera that you heard about earlier. But one of the things the commission asked us to do is go out and do a work group engaging with local governments, NGOs, industry, and our staff, create a work group, and then report back to them. So we've done that, and so this is the rule, and that's the big focus that we're trying to tackle. What's the work group? How can we use these pieces of equipment to monitor that? Well, the first part, it's on our website. You can go take a look at it, and it's in library special projects, and you can take a look at it. But and the final report is there. But one of the big things we wanted to do is create a background so that the work group had a background. What are the instruments that are available? They also asked us to take a look at the risk. What's the risk around these flow lines, and is there a way to model that risk? So we reached out to the academic institutions. Colorado State, you heard about their METEC site, where they've done a lot of testing on equipment. They hadn't done a lot of testing on buried pipelines, but Dr. Catherine Smits, she was at Colorado School of Mines, now she's at University of Texas, Arlington. But she put a pipeline out there, buried it, put methane in it, and tried to see if she could see that gas leak. And she was more looking at it from the perspective of emissions. Can I see a 500 parts per million leak? And basically, if she put her instrument about an inch off the ground, she could see it. So that's not necessarily realistic. So it kind of goes at the issue that a leak needs to be pretty large, and what we try to characterize in our final report is a perspective that you've got an emission type release and then you've got an integrity failure type release. So you need to kind of evaluate that perspective. And then we asked Colorado School of Mines, Dr. Fleckenstein kind of led that group to look at risk models. What kind of risk models are out there? And the answer is there aren't really any. There are qualitative models, which we kind of have already, where you say, how close am I to a receptor? A receptor being a population, a water body. And we use our GIS system to then created a qualitative model, but one of the things that Mines came up is a recommendation that we need to move to a more add elements of more quantitative, so we can then model these things in that sense. Of course, I got the note I'm running out of time, so I'm going to flash through a few here real quick. What we audited our data, the spill data, looking at types of spills, how it was discovered, what the materials were, and sort of the root cause. Well, the big walk away here is the blue. Most of these spills were related to produced water. And you can see, I think our integrity program is working, that we're drawing attention to the fact that these lines need to have integrity, and it is declining. And the next thing is, how are these discovered? Well, most of them are discovered through visual, that AVO survey. There is an element of excavation, and you kind of lump those all together. Somebody's doing some construction activity on location, and they've discovered this leak. So that's, if you collapse those all together, that's a pretty good percentage. Next is, what's the general root cause? Well, there's a tie-in to the fact that it's produced water, but corrosion is the largest issue related to these failures. But there's also an element of incorrect operation. Most of those are related to the fact that somebody didn't close a valve, or they weren't diligent in closing the valve, they didn't completely close the valve. And then there is the welds. I'm going to go into that in a second. But natural force damage. Again, that goes at the produced water issue. Freeze-thaw in the winter. In your elevated locations, you tend to get some freeze-thaw scenario. In our cold bed methane fields, you get some freezing issues. And then on the material type, you can see corrosion, of course, would be a steel line. But then you can also see in the synthetics, this is your poly pipe, that is related to the welds. So they're not full attention to how those fused welds are occurring. Also, that ties into one of our regulations we tried to put in is the bedding. When you have the synthetic pipe, an element of that integrity is actually the bedding. So if you don't get good compaction underneath that pipe and then you compact on top, you'll stress that weld, and over time that weld will fail. So that's kind of the tie-in to the material type. The work group recommendation was that we create a guidance on how to use those instruments. And then the 181. The first thing we need to do is we've got to audit the 1100 series rules on flow lines for the perspective of public health, safety, and welfare. So that's kind of like task one we need to walk through. It also, 181 requires full disclosure. Right now, everything is disclosed except the mapping. So that will need to be released, or that would be my guess, is we now need to release the mapping information. The rules right now say that the local government can have it upon request, and sort of a confidentiality agreement. I get my interpretation, be my guess at this point in time. We'll have to walk through the process, but I think that confidentiality would be removed. We need to add non-destructive testing on the welds, which there's that piece. And then it's actually, we actually kind of already have it. I skipped the deactivation, reactivation. Actually, 1102 is talks about reactivation of that line, of a line. So I'm interpreting that we need to expand that one rule a little bit to talk about reactivation. Instead of just notifying us about an inactive line, we'll have to add maybe a pressure testing before you reactivate it. And the last thing is there's a bunch of discussion about certification of welders and a compliance officer. So with that, I guess I'll stop and take questions.